Hello and welcome to Campaign Legal Conversations. I'm Kimberly Hall, Director of Communications here at CLC. CLC is a national nonpartisan organization working to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process, and we believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. As we celebrate the close of Women's History Month, we're so excited to have with us today former California Assemblymember and author Mary Hayashi, whose latest book titled Women in Politics, Breaking Down the Barriers to Achieve True Representation. Mary is an award-winning author who is among the country's most accomplished champions for diversity and women's rights. As a national healthcare leader, public affairs consultant, nonprofit director, and former California State Assembly member, Mary has dedicated her life to serving America and its most vulnerable citizens. Women in Politics is a compelling exploration of the strides made by women in government. This essential analysis bridges the gap between past and present, blending Mary's personal journey as an Asian American immigrant and former California State Assembly member with the inspiring stories of trailblazing women in political leadership. Moderating today's discussion is CLC Senior Director for Policy and Strategic Partnerships, Catie Kelley, who oversees CLC policy work at the federal, state, and local levels. Previously, Catie built and ran CLC's state campaign finance program, and in that capacity, she worked with the state and local stakeholders and policymakers to advance innovative policies designed to decrease the influence of money in the political process. She began her career in the Federal Elections Commission's Office of the General Counsel. Before I turn it over to Catie, I would like to review a few housekeeping items. First, please use the comment section on Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn to submit your questions. At the end of the discussion, we will do our best to get to each question, but in the interest of time, we may not be able to answer every question. If we're not able to answer your question today and you're a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. And if you're a member of the public and we are not able to get to your question today, please email us at info@campaignlegal.org. Now I'd like to turn it over to Catie. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for the introduction. And Mary, we're just so delighted to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to dive right into discussing your book, Women in Politics, which is excellent. I hope all the audience members will go ahead and pick up a copy and read it after they hear more about the book today. The book does an excellent job of examining the progress we've made for more representation for women in government at all levels, but that we still have more work to do, and there's still a lot of improvement to make to really achieve gender parity in terms of our representative government. And one thing that I really enjoyed about your book is that you cover the range of barriers that women are facing in political life, from the structural barriers, which is a significant component of CLC's work, and we'll certainly cover that, from the social barriers, the barriers we face in the media, and the more personal and familial expectations as well. And so I just really found it interesting that you were able to cover so much of that in your book, and I think really it speaks to your unique voice addressing these issues as a former elected lawmaker. And I'd like to start with the personal and to hear more from you about deciding to enter politics and put yourself out for political office, because that's, before we get to these structural issues, really, it starts with the decision for someone to want to enter the political realm. And so how did you get there?
Thank you so much, Catie. And, thank you and Kimberly and CLC for inviting me and for this amazing opportunity to share my journey with you all today. I have a lot to cover today, and the book is about 50,000 words. And so I'm going to try to break that down to a lot less than that. But I love your first question because, the book is very unique in that it has interviews of actual women in politics like myself. And it covers a very broad spectrum of research that exists in women in politics. And so I try to, blend the two. But what's really important with about this book is that, I try to inspire other women by sharing stories of leadership journeys. And so my journey and my work, my lifetime of public service and advocacy for mental health really started, with losing my older sister to suicide when she was 17. And, I'm from a very traditional Korean culture. My family, my parents, did not encourage any of us to seek, a position in politics or leadership positions. I think their expectation was that I would get married and have children. And I think they really wanted to take care of us in the sense that, that's the world that they knew. And as an immigrant myself, I came here when I was 12, my culture promoted silence as strength, not speaking out is what is encouraged. And it wasn't until I took a women's studies class at Cal State Long Beach when I was a freshman there. I took a class, it said in the catalog, Women Studies 101. And I actually thought that it was more about like home economics maybe, or, teaching women how to be a better mothers. I really didn't know what it was. Remember, I've only been in this country for about 5 years at that point. And so I was intrigued, and I took this class, and it was about feminist literature. And so I really fell in love with it. That class, changed my life. I realized that I didn't have to be controlled by our backgrounds or ethnicity or family histories. And I decided to, pursue a different path than my parents wanted me to. And so when I was 26, I started a national nonprofit organization looking at, health issues for Asian American women, because I kept thinking about my sister and wanted to know why she had passed. And like a good girl I was raised to be, we weren't really allowed to ask questions about her. My family really didn't want to deal with it. They'd never talked about her again. It was almost like she never existed. And so, I really wanted to find out why there's such stigma with mental illness and why Asian Americans are so invisible. So I started this nonprofit organization at age 26, and I was really glad I did, because we've had incredible successes advocating for data collection, better data collection for Asian Americans and Asian American women, health issues. And through that work, I had a chance to work for an assembly member in 1999, Daryl Steinberg, who championed mental health legislation at the time. And I was so inspired by that. And so he authored a ballot measure, Proposition 63, in 2004. It was a tax on millionaires to fund mental health treatment. And so I had an opportunity to work on that with him. And so that was the first time that I actually saw that I can do the same thing. I can run for the legislature and be like Daryl, and when I get there, I can, sponsor mental health legislation that would impact people's lives. And so that's what led me to politics, something that I've never really thought about doing until I saw somebody else do that. And so it's been a great journey, and I really am privileged to be able to have done that. And public service is something that you really want to do. You have to be very passionate about wanting that job, because it is a sacrifice. But at the same time, being able to serve and serve in that capacity is also really incredible, once in a lifetime type of opportunity. So I've had amazing journey, throughout from my childhood to now. And so I'm very grateful.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And it is so interesting to hear how, these early experiences really affect the trajectory and kind of shape what you want to see and where you see you can really make some meaningful changes. Another aspect of the book that was so interesting, in addition to your own personal experiences, was hearing from other women as well through the course of all of your interviews about why they sought to seek public office. And so I was wondering too, if you could say a little bit more about through these conversations for the book and through your experience in public service, are there any themes that kind of stick out to you in terms of why is it that women decide to run for public office? And is there a difference in terms of why their male colleagues are deciding to enter public life?
Yeah, so there's an interesting study that I discovered while I was working on this book, that college age women and men have a very different views on how they could be most effective in bringing about social change. And the study said that women choose nonprofits, whereas men choose to run for public office to make a difference. And I thought that was really interesting. It really isn't surprising because men are more likely than women to have been encouraged to run for office. And I think certainly like our society values a more masculine style of leadership, and women can sometimes, experience discouragement or often get penalized for being ambitious and strong. And I think what I found through the interviews that all of the women interviewed in my book worried about coming across as too strong, too opinionated, or taking too much credit. And studies back this up. Men really don't worry about that because they are supposed to be ambitious. They are supposed to seek leadership positions. And so it's very natural for people, the voters to see men run for office. But when women want to show ambition or want to run for office, they're often their motivations are often, questioned, and people get suspicious about why they're running.
That is so interesting. And to start with that kind of hurdle, right? And for some people to kind of question your intention or your motivation to begin that journey to begin with that's just that initial reaction when you share with somebody that you want to run and then get that sort of instant negative feedback. That can be quite powerful, I think. It also speaks to, I think, something else that you mentioned in the book that I thought was so interesting, the imagination barrier. And I'm wondering if you could say more to the audience about what that is and how that can factor into some of these early decisions about running.
Yes. I love talking about the imagination barrier because this is, it will take a long time for us to, to really get rid of all these unconscious bias. But I think there's already lots of evidence of progress as well. And so when we talk about the imagination barrier, what I'm talking about is the role modeling effect, and political scientists sort of references as, what you can't be what you can't see. One of the women interviewed for my book, Amanda Hunter, she is the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation in Boston. She talked about her organization's most recent focus group research. And when the participants were asked to picture a governor, an overwhelming majority said they envisioned a man. So what they did was they gave this unconscious bias a name, and they called it an imagination barrier. It just means that people can't, the bias cannot allow people to imagine seeing a different kind of person, doing these jobs. But at the same time, when women are elected to public office, it breaks down that imagination barrier in voters' minds and helps them reimagine what leadership roles look like. I think we're already making progress, but it's something that is very powerful, because research suggests that, having women in powerful positions can inspire other women. Like, you don't even have to know them personally, but just seeing what's possible and that exposure to positive women role models can help reduce implicit bias that women, may hold.
Yeah, and the imagination barrier, I think, is such an apt term too, because if you can't see it, if you can't visualize it, it's hard to imagine it. And if I could just share one anecdote from my own life, I have a daughter, and we have one of these rulers at home that has pictures of all the presidents on it, and the years that they served in office. And she was 5. She took a look at this thing and she said to me, well, why aren't there any women on here? And it's like, this is the information she's receiving from early on. Mm-hmm. So again, just having those role models and having somebody you can see doing these jobs and in these leadership positions from early on are just so important.
Right. And that's a great, reminder. And also want to point out that for men to, sort of reimagine, we need to see other men, who are happy supporting their spouse in leadership positions, as it is for women to see in leadership positions. So when we see, Vice President Kamala Harris's, husband, second gentleman, he's very you see him very happy supporting his wife, who's in a leadership position. Those examples are also very important as well. So when we talk about imagination barrier, it sort of, applies both genders. Mm-hmm. Men need to see more men who are comfortable supporting their spouse. When Sarah Palin ran, her husband was ridiculed. I mean, he was made fun of, and people, said he was, stay-home dad, which implied negative connotation. And I think those are bad examples. We want to encourage more men to be supportive. And so when we talk about imagination barrier, it's both genders. They need to.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think it is nice that we do have some more examples now of men supporting a spouse in a female spouse in a leadership role. We've touched on this a little bit already, but I would like to dive in a little bit more into the role of the media in all of this, in terms of creating additional barriers and propagating some of these stereotypes that we have already touched on a little bit. And so how do you see the media playing into barriers for women in political life?
Yes. Yeah, this is a big topic for women in politics. And, all politicians, men and women, they experience the glare of media coverage and, volatile news environment. So we're not talking about that. But when women run for public office, they're evaluated more for their appearance and personality and family background. And so when, like all the studies that I found, said that when the press talks about a woman's candidate's looks, she becomes less likable. So it doesn't matter whether the coverage is positive or negative. Unfortunately, women's style and appearance are connected to their likability. So we sort of start at a deficit. And so it's very dangerous when the press doesn't, cover us for policy issues. I call that, style over substance, because men are usually, and I think this is very true, like in social media world, and there's certainly a dark side to social media, but it really presents an enormous risk for women in politics, because male politicians are usually attacked for their professional responsibilities and their policy positions. Whereas women in politics tend to be attacked on their physical appearance and embarrassing images, and that's what they do. And so, you know, certainly negative campaigning was one of the deterrents for women for running, but media and the role of media and social media is a huge factor, and it contributes to the problem of women being underrepresented in government. And I don't know if you remember the first State of the Union address by President Joe Biden. Vice President Harris was sitting in the back, and she was wearing a brown suit. Why do I bring this up? Because the day after the State of the Union, the social media and just everybody were just really criticizing the color of her suit. I mean, why is this relevant to anything? I mean, they called for like fashion police. They said she was wearing a UPS uniform because it's brown. And so whatever the message Joe Biden was trying to get across wasn't really getting through, because everybody was focused on the vice president's brown suit. So this is very dangerous, and I think it would be helpful if if we had more accountability with these social media platforms, and companies to just be mindful of what that does. Sarah Palin actually never said, "I can see Russia from my house," and I talk about that in my book. Whether you like her or not, that's not the issue, but that wasn't her quote. She said, "You can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska." That's what she said. But if you ask anyone about Sarah Palin's Russia quote, people will remember the one that is not accurate. And so these types of examples aren't helpful, and it will continue to play a role in underrepresentation of women in government.
Yeah, and I had forgotten that "You Can See Russia from My House" came from Saturday Night Live, and I think too, kind of the which of course is satire, and they're not attempting to accurately represent things but poke fun, but still the problems that can create too with both traditional media, social media, and some of these other platforms that can build a narrative that can be so problematic in the long run.
Yes, it really is. And, Nikki Haley, whether you like her or not, I mean, that's not what we're here to talk about. I don't agree with everything she stands for, but I thought she did an incredible job pointing out the sexism in the media when she was a candidate. And, one of her opponents said she was Dick Cheney on high heels. Comments like that will not be directed at a male candidate. And I think Nikki Haley did a great job representing herself. She was articulate, she's smart, and she called out on the media for covering those types of quotes. So I thought that was good.
Yeah. Well, it is nice to see some positive examples. And again, in terms of role modeling and looking for examples, how can these things effectively be called out by candidates? And, I agree that Nikki Haley did do a good job calling it out when she was faced with those characterizations. And, I think the more we could see their male counterparts also calling out those negative stereotypes that women in politics are facing too, that would help a lot as well. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit now to talk about some of the more structural issues. And of course, campaign finance is a big part of the Campaign Legal Center's work, and thinking about our campaign finance system in terms of the barriers that it creates for women candidates and people of color and other minority candidates. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what do we mean here that the campaign finance system creates barriers? And what are the specific things that are particularly a challenge for women running for political office?
Yes, I'd like to start my answer by referencing a study that was done by the New York Times, and it's to examine the power and influence gap. And the article is titled "Fewer Women Run Big Companies Than Men Named John." And so the gender wealth gap is a consequence to the fact that women have not been financially independent for a long time. It's only in the 20th century that women began pursuing financial independence from men. Men continue to have deeper pockets, and the wage gap continues to be a problem in this country. I think women earn 79 cents for every dollar men earn. For Latinas, on average, they're paid 46% less than white men, for example. And even though Latinas are attending college at higher rates than ever before, it really hasn't eliminated the pay gap. Latinas have a bachelor's degree now, 31%. Latinas with a bachelor's degree earn about 30% less than white men on average. And, a lot of the studies that I looked at, attribute this to stereotype that many Latinas are domestic workers in lower paying jobs and not ambitious in their careers. And so the employers think that, they don't expect to be paid well at all. And so, why do I talk about all of this? Because fundraising challenges can be a major obstacle to women candidates, and women politicians still to this day report being excluded from financial circles that include the wealthiest and well-connected donors. One example that I talk about in the book was I had an opportunity to work on Mayor Karen Bass's campaign last year. And she's the first woman to be mayor of Los Angeles. She's the first Black woman to serve in that role. She was also the first Black woman Speaker of the Assembly in the United States. And our campaign raised $9 million. And when people hear that, women tell me, oh, that's a lot, and it is. And the limit is $1,500 per person. The majority of our donors were average $100 donors or less. And her opponent was able to write a check to the campaign for $107 million. And this is just his, own personal money. And so we were, he outraised us obviously by a lot. But Karen still won. And I love talking about this because, I think because of social media and when I ran, social media wasn't around, and fundraising meant making cold calls to people that I've never met before, mostly men. And if you're a Democrat, you have a lot of sort of union donors. And at the time, they were mostly men. But now you can actually have these, you can get your message out on social media quickly and, get information out to people, raise money. And so there are a lot of infrastructures that are available to women, if they're not wealthy, if they don't have a lot of money. Like Karen doesn't bring a lot of personal wealth to the table, but she had better messaging, and she had enormous amount of support from small donors across the country. And so it's an inspiring story because political action committees tend to fund incumbents. And who are the incumbents? More men are incumbents than women. And so, it's just sort of that cycle, and we're like, well, how do we disrupt the cycle? How do we get PAC to give more to women? And so, when a woman challenges a male incumbent, obviously, that's very tough. But AOC did incredibly well, just, with her small donors, and I don't think she expected to win. And that's sort of an extreme case, not the most normal situation, but I think she did an incredible job, and women have overcome these significant barriers to fundraising, but fundraising challenges still continue because women just have less money than men.
Right. And the ability to, if you have less money, less ability to fund your own campaign, which is something that we see as well. We frequently get asked what impact money makes in a campaign and will the better candidate win? And the answer is no. A lot of it depends on the candidate. So I think, it is nice in your book to see these examples of the voters are going to choose at the end of the day. Money is the money helps, certainly. But, at the end of the day, the voters are going to choose the candidate that they best is going to do the best job, best represents them. And so, I think that it's nice to see these stories lifted up in your book.
Yes. I mean, it's a factor, but you don't have to have the most to win. You just need enough. You just need enough to, you have to have money, unfortunately, because you have to let people know that you're running. So you definitely need that opportunity to communicate with voters. So you don't, what I tell candidates is that, when you're up against a very well-connected, well-funded, billionaire candidate, male candidate, it doesn't mean that you can't win. It really doesn't. And there's just so many examples of women running against really well-established candidates and winning. But it's hard.
Yeah,
it's hard at the same time.
Well, stepping for a minute outside of what's covered in your book, and I did ask you about this beforehand, so it's not a surprise. But as I was reading this book, and you so thoroughly cover all of these factors that going into deciding to run, and identifying these barriers that are particularly faced by women, and then you yourself won, of course, and served in public office and in a state with term limits. And so tell me about some of the, I have in mind particularly term limits, but once you are serving in office, what are some of the things that you face there that might impact a woman legislator differently than a male counterpart?
Yeah, and in California, and this doesn't apply to all the states, but in California, the voters actually passed Proposition 140 in 1980, and this was to address concerns about career politicians, and the sitting incumbents were impossible to beat. Let's get rid of those career politicians, and we can get citizen legislature. That was really the thinking behind it. And but the ballot measure, didn't stop. It was intended to stop the existence of career politicians, but all it did was it just changed where they go. So term limit did not revolutionize the type of legislators who comes to Sacramento. It just you just have to campaign for a different office. And so people are just constantly running. In 2012, though, California voters passed another proposition which modified the first one, Proposition 140, and it just basically allowed state legislators to serve 12-year limit of total legislative service in either house. So you can stay 12 years in the Assembly or the Senate. When I was there, it was 6 years in the Assembly and then 8 years in the Senate. And so they try to basically create some stability with the last voter passed proposition that modified the original thinking on this. But when I was there, I served under 3 different speakers. So that's a lot of change. So every term I have a new leader. And whenever there's a new leader, there's new assignments, new committee chairs, The change was just constant. And the minute you get there, you only have 6 years. And so, people are already thinking about what they're going to run for next. And so this was a real, I think, to me, very unstable and creates a lot of problems. And even now with the modified proposition, I think there's increased stability, but legislators are still very much seen as transients. And the lobbyists and the staff, Capitol staff, have become the institution. So whether you support term limits or not, I mean, it's, the expectation of the term limit advocates, I think, was that women would be allowed to run because, there were predominantly men. And so, when we get rid of the career politicians, more women will serve, will have an opportunity to run and serve. And I think, it just depends on who you talk to. I have mixed feelings about this because, like in 2000, after 10 plus years, actually 20, almost 20 years after the initial, ballot measure passed, we didn't have that many women. We were, I think when I got elected, there were 22 of us out of 120. And so I didn't really feel like there was a huge impact. At the same time, once we get more women into office, they're also turned out as well. So the recruitment efforts have to be constant. I think there are good arguments on both sides. I think the term limit advocates think that it's still helpful to have that, just so that it allows more women to run, more opportunities to win. When it's open, it's easier than running against a sitting incumbent, that's for sure. But the World Economic Forum, last year said that it will take 143 years at this pace to achieve gender parity. So, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out with the longer terms now, and probably need a little more time to get a sense of how those will impact the legislature. But in other states as well, we have seen this shift of institutional knowledge outside of the legislature with term limits. So kind of an unintended consequence, I think, of this particular policy choice. On that note, I would love to hear more too. What do you think can be done to lower some of these barriers and get more women into public office?
Well, I mean, let's start with the easy one.
Okay.
Because so many women in my book said that they ran for office after somebody encouraged them. I mean, it was simple as that. And recruitment efforts are really one of the few tools that we have available that can be used to disrupt the vicious cycle of the imagination barrier. And so the women in my book basically said, somebody said that I should consider this, or my mentor or my boss, and so recruitment efforts, I think, would be really helpful. And I think that Republican Party, has people like Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who basically, I mean, she's this young woman who, on her own, recruited over 100 Republican women to run for office. And I think it's pretty amazing. And she had a lot of pushback within her caucus. And so I really admire her efforts. But I think party leaders definitely need to step up. And it's not just Republican Party. I mean, I think the Democratic Party, gives a good sort of lip service, and they talk a lot about that. But my first encounter with the local Democratic Party chair when I ran, and I told her I wanted to run for office, and I had, all these amazing endorsements and experience, and she, discouraged me from running. And so I think we really need to educate the party leaders and hold them accountable. I also have a chapter in my book about mentoring and allyship, because so many men have encouraged women to run for office. From the women that I've interviewed, they all talked about what an important role a male bosses and role models had as well. So it's not just women. It's not like up to all women to mentor all women. It also has to be about men and their participation, because they're better messengers to other men when we talk about gender equality. So I think that's another, a strategy. The thing that's really hard to change is the gender stereotypes and biases that we talked about. I remember when we were organizing this Women for Karen Bass event in LA, one of the women participants who came to this Women for Karen event asked Karen, why do you think that you are strong enough to lead Los Angeles? And so, this question shows, a very profound bias that women are too delicate, too feminine to lead. And so, just sort of so it's breaking those barriers down. I think the stereotypes are very harmful, and, just educating more people about like our own biases, I think is much harder to do. One of the experiences that I talk about in my book after I got elected was that another colleague of mine, Fiona Ma, who's our state treasurer now, we got elected at the same time to the state assembly, and people used to mix us up all the time. People used to call me Fiona, and they would call Fiona Mary, and I call that misidentification, which, according to political scientists, the constant mix-up where people lack the motivation to process an individual more deeply, it does take a toll on the women politician over time, and it really contributes to the sense of isolation, invisibility, like you don't matter, and so I think those are the type of issues that are much harder to break down, and hopefully through forums like this and my book, we can sort of help break that down, break those barriers down.
It's interesting too, kind of on the policy front too. We've seen some good steps at the federal level with the Federal Election Commission. Candidates can now use campaign funds to help defray childcare cost expenses when they're running, and that is a change that was put into motion by a female candidate and strongly supported by women candidates. But it benefits everybody, right? And it's going to help make running for office a little bit more manageable for all candidates who are also balancing parenting responsibilities. And then the other recently passed change is allowing federal candidates to take a salary from their campaign, which again just helps a little bit to lower the barrier for some of the financial barriers that everybody faces to run. And I think that benefits all candidates, but particularly women candidates.
Right, and in the chapter where I talk about the politics of motherhood,
yeah,
because women candidates get this question a lot. Do you have children? And if you have small children, voters will wonder. I mean, they'll be concerned, like, oh, can she be a good mom and also still be available to do the job as an elected official? And then if you don't have children, voters critique you and say, well, they should really understand what families go through. And so, in all the years that I've watched, presidential debates, for example, I don't think I've ever heard somebody ask a male candidate that question. So this, they're very unique, I think, barriers and cultural barriers, for women seeking, public office, and the policies that we talked about, those changes, I think really do help and support that narrative, saying, well, yes, women carry all these responsibilities, and they make their decision to run, not just, based on what they think, but they think collectively. They think about their kids, they think about their, spouse. How would that impact them? In the same way that, men go into businesses for themselves because they seek a leadership position and they want to be the CEO of their own company, whereas women tend to, start their own business because they want to be flexible and they want to be available for their kids and their family. And so it's very different, very different cultural issues we're dealing with. And same thing in politics for women.
Yeah. Well, the time has flown by, and we're at the point where we're going to open it up for some audience questions. Those should show up on the screen here. We just need a second.
I know I really need to shorten my answers, but I have so much that I want to share. Sorry if I went over my time limit.
No, you did not go over the time. We much prefer to make it more conversational and to hear the depth of your answers rather than to cut it short. So this is great. All right. So first question, how can we engage young women and girls in the political process and inspire them to become future leaders in their communities?
A couple weekends ago, I had an opportunity to speak to about 70 or 80 high school girls from all over Bay Area. It was really great. They organize this conference every year, and it's not particularly about politics, but it's about leadership. And so I was just thrilled. And at the beginning of my talk, I said, how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you are thinking about politics and want to run for office? And two girls raised their hands. So then I said, okay. So I gave my talk, which was like 20 minutes or so. And then after that, and I said, okay, now, how many of you want to run for office? And only one person raised her hand. So then I thought, oh God, I need to maybe stop talking. I'm losing ground. And after that, I did my book signing, and I had a chance to talk to the individual girls, just privately. And so many of them came up to me and said, I am really interested in politics, but I am just worried that I am not good enough. Can I go to law school? Can I be a lawyer? And, is that what I'm supposed to do? But there's a lot of interest there. And so I was very encouraged. It was the bottom line. And I think with young girls, especially, just the way we encourage, boys to be more ambitious and seek a leadership position, I think we should do the same. And you'll be surprised how much impact that would have on young people. And so I think by these examples in my book, these women who have basically experienced many barriers to entry, but have successfully run for office and run again even after they don't win. I think those are the examples, to continue that narrative. You can't be what you can't see, and by showing these examples and encouraging them, when they're really young, I think really is very helpful.
Yeah, and I will say I certainly have had points in my own career too when people say, well, if it's not you, it's going to be somebody else, so why not you, right? And so I think just having that sense of, yeah, there is somebody who's going to be in those positions and who needs to be in those leadership roles. And I think just starting to see that it could be you rather than somebody else is really empowering.
Well, so a lot of the girls were saying they wanted to be like engineers and doctors, and so I was like encouraged, you know. But I think with politics, still, it's you know, just culturally, it's very hard for parents to want something like that for their kids, you know, because it's complex. You know, there's the negative campaigning, there's the media, there's you know, there's like fundraising challenges. I mean, I'm from a country where we weren't supposed to ask strangers for money, God forbid. You know, so from that, I had to transition into, you know, making cold calls, you know, soliciting money for my campaign. And so I think it's very tough for like women of color, like Asian American women. We're just not raised or encouraged to you know, engaged in those types of activities.
Yeah,
Much more complex.
much more complex.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. I think we're ready for our next question. What measures can be taken to address online harassment and abuse directed at women in politics? And how can we create safer digital spaces for women to participate in political discourse? Great question.
It is. And, you know, we continue to have, I mean, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, you know, decided not to run, so she's not in Congress anymore, but she led the international effort. I mean, not just within the United States, but just globally, organizing women in politics to basically lobby these major social media platforms, you know, so that they can be held accountable, because they just, you know, they basically have the same line. You know, it's like we can't do censorship, and so I think there's been concerted efforts at the sort of federal level, but it's mostly women. It's very interesting, you know, women leaders taking this on. I think on sort of individual level, one of the things that I talk a lot about with candidates running is that social media definitely has that sort of dark side, but you can definitely control your brand. You have those tools as well. You know, when I ran, we didn't really have those. It was like you can only send your messages out by mailing to people. But now you can actually create your own brand, own messaging, and control that on your social media platforms or websites. And so it kind of cuts both ways. And so I always tell people to be very responsive and sort of define your brand before anybody else does, and respond quickly, and always address you know, false information. Obviously there's degrees of that too, but I mean, I've seen good examples. I mean, AOC is a really good example. So it can be done. I'm not saying it's easy, but definitely there needs to be something at sort of the federal level. There needs to be a government solution holding them accountable. But you know, women can also control their brand a lot better nowadays than ever before.
Thank you. And thanks, Sophie, for that question. I think we're ready for our next question. How did the issues you've been discussing impact women from communities of color or women from the LGBT community?
Well, I think, well, one of the chapters in my book talks about, you know, racial bias, and you know, women of color in particular are not automatically sort of seen as a candidate who can win. And so, you know, we talked about the importance of fundraising, and you know, fundraising has played a big role in whether you can, you know, win that position. And I think that those stereotypes of, you know, Asian women being sort of submissive, for example, and grateful, and you know, we're often penalized when we present a you know, a counter to the stereotype. And so it It does impact women of color in a unique way because many of them are not seen viable because of these stereotypes. And studies have shown that women of color candidates experience discouragement at a much higher rate than white women, for example. In terms of LGBTQ community, one of the women interviewed, actually two women interviewed in my book, have talked about that. And former Senator Kathleen Galgiani, she ran in a very conservative district out of Central Valley in California, and she came out as a lesbian before she ran for the Senate seat. And I remember her consultants were saying, maybe you shouldn't. And she's like, I really want to. And she did, and she won, and it was amazing. And so I can't really speak to other parts of the country or a state, but in California, I think, they obviously had to overcome a lot of challenges, but we've had enormous successes in electing LGBTQ community, people from that community.
Thank you for that. And I think we'll go to our last question and then wrap up with some concluding comments from Emma. What efforts are being made to support women in transitioning from community activism to advocacy roles to formal political leadership positions? And this is kind of your trajectory too.
Right. I think, so again, when I ran, there was like no emerge training opportunities, and there's a lot of that now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of opportunities that women can utilize, and I think it's Emily's List realized that they were formed to elect U.S. senators, more women U.S. senators, but they realized that they got to come from somewhere. So now they're building pipeline of women, and they're going to local city councils races and school board and state legislative races. And so that's where I think a lot of women can transition from more, of a nonprofit work. I mean, neither is wrong. It's just, if you want to pursue politics, I think there's absolutely more resources available for women, like the Emily's List does training, Emerge does training, NAACP is another organization that support women candidates. So, lots of opportunities for women to tap into.
And as you said, if women are more likely to enter into the nonprofit space, having these pipelines into elected office are so important if that's where they're getting some of these early career experiences and then being able to build from there into a public role. Well, we are just about at the end of time, and I'd love to hear any concluding thoughts you have, Mary. And you touched a little bit on what you would say to a young girl at this point, but also what would you say to somebody who's thinking, to a woman who's thinking about running for political office now, and what words do you have for folks in that space?
Yeah, well, and thank you again for today. And I just want to, make just one more point that when women run and win, and when we have more women serving in government, the interviews and the research have shown significant achievements in healthcare, education opportunities, and gender equality issues are possible because more women are serving in government. And so there's a clear benefit to everyone. And so with that in mind, I think the overarching message of my book is that if a woman wants to run for office, she should focus on what she brings to the table rather than the many barriers that we talked about. I think women tend to look at opportunities from a place of lack. We lack experience, we lack skills, money, elective office experience, campaign experience. I try to encourage women to run or consider, and that's like the first response I get is like, oh, I don't have that experience, I don't have this. And one of the studies that I cite in the book, Men Rule, it clearly shows that more men view themselves more qualified than women. when given with the same experience and resume. And so I like to use a quote from our U.S. Senator LaFonza Butler. When I interviewed her for the book, she gave this advice. She said, "Do it anyway." And I really love that, because I think that's something that I try to apply to the challenges that I've had. And so when people try to discourage me from running, when people try to discourage me from starting a national nonprofit organization for Asian American women, I sort of did it anyway. And I knew I lacked experiences and skills and money, but I did it anyway. And so that's my message. And again, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Mary. It has been such a delight to have you here and to be able to talk about your book. Again, it just does such a wonderful job, I think, of talking about the barriers and talking about the progress that we've made in terms of women in political office and in important leadership positions within political offices. So I just want to say one more time, thank you very much for your time here today and for all the trailblazing work you've done throughout your career and representing vulnerable communities. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.